us on the topic Loving Our Neighbor and the World, Cosmopolitanism and the American Future. Now, Joe Chuman is the leader of Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County, New Jersey. He's also a part-time leader here at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. He's a professor of human rights in the Graduate School of Columbia University and the author of a recently published book. Okay? He has a book, Speaking of Ethics. Oh, that's another book. So I got that wrong. So Joe will correct me. He's a lifelong progressive activist. He's a founder and president of the Bergen County Sanctuary Committee. It's the non-governmental organization that provides comprehensive services to political asylum seekers here in the United States. So as you can see, it all sort of comes together. So without much ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joe Chuman.
Hi, thank you so very, very much. It's always great being back here. On a day like this, when it's so beautiful, I'm a little bit embarrassed that you'd rather be indoors listening to me rather than outdoors gallivanting in the sunshine. I do proclaim this, by the way. It's an official proclamation. Today is the first day of spring, and it's going to stay that way, I think, for a long time. Finally, let me just say a few things. I want to thank David for his beautiful compositions, and thank him for bearing witness at the border, which I think is really marvelous, so important in this moment. Let me just say one thing. I'll put in a plug. I'm going to be back actually 4 times this week. I'm going to be back on Wednesday evening for, I think, what will be a marvelous program here, right in this room, at 7 o'clock. We're having a panel discussion based on this book called Anti-Science and the Assault on Democracy. I happen to be a contributor to the book, and I'll be moderating it. And the 3 panelists are 3 contributors. The senior editor, Michael Thompson, whom I think, Monica, we have to get for a platform here. He's really quite brilliant and marvelous. Another editor, Gregory Smilovich-Zucker, and a 3rd contributor, Diana Judd, and they're going to be talking about the assault on democracy and the assault on science, not in a journalistic fashion, but the ideas that go deeper and so on that lie behind the issues of the day. I'll be moderating. I'm a contributor, and I think this is a first in the history of the New York Society. All four participants in the program on Wednesday evening come from New Jersey. Okay, so you will be in thorough culture shock, I'm sure. But I want to show you, given that I live in New Jersey, there are people on the other side of the Hudson who do have some sophistication, right? So hopefully you'll come. There'll be a reception at 6:30 to get started, and then we'll have the panel from 7 to 9, and I hope you can join us on that important topic. My talk this morning actually, in some ways, is related to the concerns that the book deals with. I'm always looking at the issues of the moment and trying to understand them better because they're so perplexing and so disturbing. I think few of us would disagree that we live in troubled times, and a powerful aspect of that trouble is that our society is divided in ways that feel very nasty and raw. Quote, polarized is a word often used to describe our current condition. It's a condition that leaves us anxious and uncertain about our future, America's and our own. I need not dwell on how the division of American society is exacerbated by our political leadership. That we all know, and I have expounded on it many times from this platform. If you want to know about it, all you have to do is turn on the news, and 24/7 you're bombarded with it. My talk this morning may start with the problems we face, but what I want to do is look at solutions and get to focus on positive and inspiring visions. But first, a little bit of analysis. America is suffering today in very strident ways from a division which has always confronted human societies, and certainly Western societies since the 19th century. It is the division that is marked, on the one hand, by those people who are committed to what we might call local values. Local values. I include among these people who center their lives, their identities, and their loyalties primarily around their ethnic group, their religious community, their nationality, and perhaps their deeply felt political ideologies, doctrines, and positions. In centering their destinies and loyalties in this way, they may emphasize their differences from people other than themselves. They have local loyalties. In contrast to such localists, there are those who are more disposed to embracing wider allegiances. They are perhaps more comfortable with human differences and may, in fact, be intrigued by them. This outreach towards others may include a sense of responsibility for the welfare of others. Beyond their own, their loved ones, their family, their ethnic group, etc., they may feel an obligation to strangers. Such a sense of wider obligation may be a component of their ethical philosophies. Let me, for the moment, define such people as, quote, liberals, and their approach to those who are different or outside their own group may be characterized by greater tolerance. Broadly speaking, I think this is a way of describing the prevailing characteristics which define the major divisions in American society and which have reached the point of being very acrimonious in this moment. In particular, people committed to different political ideologies avoid one another, have nothing to do with one another, and increasingly are filled with contempt for one another. To apply this description to the current moment, though it may be a gross generalization, those who comprise Donald Trump's base, predominantly dominated by older white males, fall into the first group of what I'm referring to as, quote, localists. They see those in the opposing camp as, quote, coastal elites who are characterized, among other things, by a stated commitment to minorities and are dedicated to wider issues, some of a global nature, such as the plight of immigrants and refugees and climate change. They fall into the group of what I am initially referring to as liberals. Their focus is not primarily on their own group, but they look outward and beyond to others and their welfare. They have broader interests and wider loyalties. So, we have localists, that is ethno and religiocentrist nationalists and tribalists in one camp, and liberals and internationalists in the other. And each party has its representatives in government whose differences are played out on the 24-hour news cycles. Communication between the two camps has broken down and virtually disappeared, and the contempt of each for the other has grown fierce. The polarization we experience has reached the point of mutual marginalization and name-calling. Each side considers that the other has bad intentions. It has even reached a level wherein each sees the other not merely as an adversary who holds to a different viewpoint, but rather very often as an enemy whose very legitimacy as a citizen may be implicitly called into question. I need to be clear, there has never been a golden age in America. We have always been divided between what I am calling localists and those whom I'm tentatively referring to as liberals. There have always been divisions as to what America and American society should look like. In the early 19th century, different visions of American society were in a sense precursors to what we experience now. The American statesman John C. Calhoun in 1848 argued against admitting Mexicans as citizens and declared, quote, "Ours is a government of the white man," end quote. And leading up to the Civil War, the greatest divide in American history, in 1858, Stephen Douglas said, quote, "This government was made by our fathers on the white basis. It was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever," end quote. The post-Civil War amendments, which granted birthright citizenship and voting rights to all citizens, continued to unearth different visions, all male citizens, I should say, continued to unearth different visions of whom America was for. Opponents of the 15th Amendment, which extended the right to vote, found both African Americans and Chinese citizenship scandalous. A Democratic senator from Kentucky by the name of Garrett Davis declared then, quote, "I want no Negro government. I want no Mongolian government. I want the government of the white man, which our fathers incorporated," end quote. A contrary vision of America was articulated by one of the most eloquent spokespersons of the 19th century, the former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass. In defense of the 14th and 15th Amendments in speeches across the country, Douglass spoke of America as what he called a composite nation, a nation formed out of difference, Native Americans, African Americans, European, Asians, and every possible mixture. As for the Chinese, Frederick Douglass said, do you ask if I would favor such immigration? I answer I do. Would you have them naturalized and have them invested with all the rights of American citizenship? I would. Would you allow them to vote? I would, said Frederick Douglass. And then looking to the American future, Douglass said, quote, I want a home here not only for the Negro, the mulatto, and the Latin races, but the Asiatic to find a home here in the United States and feel at home here both for his sake and for ours, end quote. It's interesting that the champion of abolition and black causes in that period had a much wider view, a much more inclusive view of what American society should look like. Okay. For Douglass, for America to progress, it needed again to be a composite nation. That was his vision, and it was a vision of a harmonious society with different groups enriching each other and society as a whole. But Douglass's vision was not to be. In the 1880s, with the end of Reconstruction, we had the creation of Jim Crow laws, the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan, and the vile history of lynchings in America. That story has not yet been fully told. I mean, between the Civil War and the 1950s, we had close to 5,000 people who were lynched, almost all, not all, but almost all African Americans. We also had in 1882 the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal law restricting immigration, which betrayed the constitutional promises of the 14th and 15th Amendments. While it is often forgotten, the Ku Klux Klan, after World War I, in its second instantiation, its first instantiation was after Reconstruction ended, okay? But its second instantiation took place after World War I. The Klan then was a huge and highly visible grassroots organization. By 1925, it claimed a membership of somewhere between 2 and 5 million members, with many more sympathizers. It was an era when Woodrow Wilson, who was extremely racist even for his own time, and cleansed the federal government of all black employees. Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft were actually better in terms of including blacks in the federal bureaucracy. When Wilson came in, he basically engaged in ethnic cleansing in terms of the federal government. You know, Wilson, of course, came from the South. He was a Southerner, right? And he would bemoan, Wilson would, the sort of romantic refrain often invoked by Southerners of the so-called, quote, lost cause of the Confederacy. Okay, that was a sad moment for Southerners, a rubric which became again, painted the Confederacy in noble terms. As the 20th century progressed, illiberal nationalism took other forms. One form was to enforce American isolationism in the world. In 1917, William Randolph Hearst called for, quote, America first, common refrain, which became a movement leading up to the Second World War, a movement which topped 800,000 members. In the years before World War II, a father, Charles Coughlin, a rabid anti-Semite and radio broadcaster with a huge audience, proclaimed his admiration for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, and called on his audiences to form a new political party under the title of, quote, the Christian Front. In 1939, okay, we coastal New York City was not immune. In 1939, about 20,000 Americans, some dressed in Nazi uniforms, gathered in Madison Square Garden, decorated with swastikas and American flags with posters declaring, quote, mass demonstration for true Americanism, end quote, where they denounced the New Deal as the Jew Deal. Nazi propaganda was actually distributed throughout the South, calling for the repeal of the 14th and 15th Amendments. These were among the most virulent expressions of ethno-nationalism, of what I'm calling localism in its extreme. The division between those of narrower nationalistic, localistic, and tribal interpretations of what America should be, and those of more expansive and liberal visions cut in other ways as well. I'd like to tell my students, my undergraduates particularly, I teach at Hunter as well as Columbia, I'd like to tell my undergraduates about the great religious divides in this country, which for them can only be history, but for all of you, or most of you and me, is actually memory. okay? If you were born before the late 1970s, this is not something that is part of your historical memory, but it certainly is mine. Throughout its history until the late 1970s, the United States was definitively a Protestant-dominant society. Protestant-dominant society. The Episcopal Church, which has now shrunk in recent decades to only a few million members, not long ago functionally came closest to what we might refer to as an established religion in the United States. An aspect of that Protestant dominance has been a vitriolic suspicion, and most Americans aren't aware of this these days, a vitriolic suspicion of Catholics, especially Irish and Italian immigrants. A hatred fueled by the Ku Klux Klan. Of course, on the Klan's hate list, it's clear that blacks were at the very top, but second on their hate roster were not Jews, surprisingly, but Catholics, particularly Catholic immigrants coming from Ireland and Italy. The assumption was that Catholics could not be trusted, simply could not be trusted, because their highest allegiance was not to the United States Constitution, okay, or to the US itself, but rather to the Pope in Rome. The canard was that American Catholicism was a front for papal designs to take over the United States. I remember this. I like to tell my students I actually met John Kennedy once, and he was very handsome, by the way. He was very good looking, right? I actually met him once. I will recall that John Kennedy when John Kennedy ran for the presidency in 1960, he had to bend over backwards, time and time again, to tell his audiences that if elected, his highest allegiance would be to the US Constitution and not to the Pope of Rome, and that he believed, he had said at one point, in the absolute separation of church and state. Now, technically, you can't have an absolute, there has to be some accommodation. But he said, I believe in the absolute separation of church and state. And he did this over and over and over again, and of course became our only Catholic president. I should say that Jackie, this is an anecdote, Jackie said during that time, I don't know what all the hoopla is about John or Jack being a Catholic. He's not a very good Catholic after all, right? She knew about his shenanigans going on, which I'm sure she did not like very much, right? Now, and to make this more interesting, okay, although it may not be really totally relevant to the moment, but I have to include it. To make this more interesting, one of the Protestant leaders of the anti-Kennedy campaign was the highly distinguished baronial Protestant minister of the Tony Marble Collegiate Church down on Fifth Avenue, Norman Vincent Peale, who organized fellow Protestant clergy, and it got support on the sidelines from Billy Graham, I mentioned, to try to do whatever they could to undermine Kennedy's campaign on the grounds that he was a front. John Kennedy was a front for a Catholic takeover of the United States. And I think it's an interesting fact of history of probably little or no significance that Norman Vincent Peale was Donald Trump's minister, right? And certainly his father, Fred's minister, okay? Because I don't think Donald went to church very often. But there's a connection there. American history and society, my point here is, American history and society have oscillated between these two tendencies, the local and the liberal throughout. The conservatism and conformity of the Eisenhower years of the 50s was broken open with the advent of the 1960s and the flourishing of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the New Left, which spoke to grassroots creativity and a diversity in popular culture and an attack on the conformity of an increasingly corporate society. These movements were followed by the gay rights movement, the rights for people with disabilities, and the celebration of a more open and diverse society. To simplify what is a long and complex story, I think we are witnessing now, in part, in fact, years later, 60 years later, a parochial, nationalistic, politically tribalistic backlash against the diversifying, progressive, and liberalizing tendencies of the 1960s. 50 years later, it is exemplified in the local and illiberal national reaction epitomized in the Trump constituency. So, given this history and given our polarized condition, what is to be done? I think a way out needs to begin with a vision, which is the centerpiece of my message this morning. Most of us, I suspect, are the legatees of a more liberal interpretation of American history and American society. A history expounded by such historians as Arthur Schlesinger, a friend of the Kennedys, who argued that liberals occupied, quote, the vital center of American politics. But if we focus American history on liberty, rights, revolution, freedom, and equality, all those good liberal things, we simply cannot be blind at the same time to the influence of racism, slavery, segregation, bigotry, and exclusion as another narrative coursing through American history. We have two narratives, okay? The liberal narrative and the narrative that goes in the other direction. American history has both the narratives of progressive liberalism as well as nativism, localist, and racist backlashes coursing throughout it. The historical currents I've been reviewing, except for the last, were of course before my time. I cannot speak to the national atmosphere and anxieties of the post-Reconstruction era or what it felt like to be alive in the populist, nationalist, extremist environments brought on by the America First movement during the 1930s and World War II. But I do know what it is like to live now. And I would hazard a guess that the divisions we confront now are even more perilous. What I think makes the age of Trump distinctive is that the emotions that lie behind it and fuel the divisions in our society are so powerful that they not only swamp reason and rationality, but actually dissolve it at its core. Hatred of immigrants, blacks, Jews, Catholics, immigrants, gays, and other minorities may have been rooted in powerful emotional impulses, but I don't think that these despicable trends led to the very dissolution of reason itself. And I know that extremist wings of American society have often promoted irrational conspiracy theories, whether it was Catholics to take over the US government, Jewish bankers taking over the world, or the John Birch Society, which saw communists behind every tree. American society has always had its nutty expressions, but I don't think that they have ever spread so deep, so wide, and so corrosively as they do at this moment. Reason seems to count for little these days, and feeling a great deal. Reason is in peril in politics, in high places in society, as I believe it has never been before. We live in the age of alternative facts, much of it, fueled by the deluge of social media, where anybody can put out an alternative fact, and immediately you have millions of people, and it's hard for reason, which speaks, as Freud said, with a soft voice, to be able to countermand the deluge of bad ideas. The virtue of reason is that it is objective, impersonal, and unbiased as an arbiter in guiding people as to what to believe. But what happens to democracy and society when powerful feelings drive people not to care about reason itself anymore? So what vision of American society can we put forward that can inspire us to get beyond these deep divisions, beyond the polarization which is fueled by such powerful emotions? It seems to me that almost from its inception, American society has appropriated three different approaches to American identity, what it means to be an American. From the early decades of the 19th century until the mid-1960s, the prevailing American identity was that of the, quote, melting pot. I will recall being taught about the melting pot in elementary school. In fact, we even had to learn little songs that we sang to the melting pot in elementary school. It was the prevailing ideology. The melting pot ideal is that people come from all over the world to the United States and leave their cultural identities of where they came from back in their countries of origin. And instead, they appropriate a new American identity, which is a blended mix of all these different cultures, but something new and distinctive. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said in the 1840s, quote, "The energy of Irish, Germans, Swedes, Poles, and Cossacks, and all the European tribes, of the Africans and of the Polynesians, will construct a new race, a new religion, a new state, a new literature, which will be as vigorous as the new Europe, which came out of what he called the smelting pot," not the melting pot, but the smelting pot of the Dark Ages, end quote. The image of America, in other words, would reflect what we call an assimilationist ideal. This ideal had its critics, but it prevailed pretty much unchallenged until the late 1960s with the emergence of the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement, as small as it was, changed the nature of American identity and demography. okay? It was a militant rejection of the integrationist aims of the civil rights movement. Despite its small size, the Black Power movement actually transformed how many Americans understand their identity as Americans. Its leadership claimed that while Irish, Italians, Greeks, Jews, and so forth could melt into American society, blacks, as a consequence of the color of their skin and the ineradicable reality of racism, never could. What the Black Power movement also did was to unmask the melting pot, not as something innocent, but as an expression not of a neutral American identity, but really as a form of Anglo-dominance. It was a hidden form of Anglo-dominance. Hence, American Negroes became African Americans, which ushered in the phenomenon of hyphenated Americans. This involved with pride factoring into one's Americanism a positive appreciation of one's racial, ethnic, religious backgrounds, which previous generations might have been happy to leave behind and forget. So now we have today, and have long had, Italo-Americans, Latino-Americans, Jewish Americans, and then gender became a component of one's identity as well. You don't come from New Jersey, but I remember we had an ignominious governor not so long ago who was caught up in scandal, and when he resigned, Governor McGreevey said in his resignation speech, "I am a proud gay American," right? So in effect, his sexual orientation became part of his identity as Americans. And so multiculturalism, with this sort of hyphenated notion of American identity, multiculturalism was born, which had at its center a celebration of cultural difference, and its watchword was that of tolerance. Americans were not exclusively one people, but a mix of different subgroups, and it became of prevailing importance to celebrate this diversity and this difference. Multiculturalism, in turn, became the basis of what has become known as, quote, identity politics, whereby people express their political interests through their distinctive and parochial identities, whether it be racial, ethnic, or gender identities. Indeed, identity politics has certainly been a powerful political force, especially for those minorities who have been the object of oppression, marginalization, and invisibility throughout our history, and it remains so. But, friends, multiculturalism is not without its problems. In the first instance, while multiculturalism requires that the relationship between different cultural groups be one of tolerance, and this is all to the good, we can ask the question, how is society to respond if the groups that we are tolerating are internally intolerant to their own members or violate what we consider to be basic rights and norms of society? Under multiculturalism, we should tolerate religious groups which entertain values very different from our own. But what if these groups are excessively patriarchal? What if the Amish refuse to educate their children beyond the age of 14? Or some groups, religious or not, refuse to vaccinate their children? Or children in the Hasidic schools are not taught to read or write English? How far should tolerance extend in these cases and others? In addition, multiculturalism does not prescribe how different cultural groups should relate to each other than tolerate each other, which can be achieved simply by ignoring one another to go about one's business as they please. Such an ideology leads perhaps to the disuniting of America in the minds of many of its critics, and they may have a valid point. Arthur Schlesinger, I mentioned a while ago, wrote a book called The Disuniting of America, which was a critique of multiculturalism. He was very fearful that it would basically pull America apart unless we could reestablish what in effect were universal values, principles, and ideals that all people would maintain as Americans. Perhaps the time has come, this all leads to this, perhaps the time has come to envision and to advocate for another way of understanding American society, a third way, an American identity. And what I propose is the renewal of what is actually a very old idea, namely that of cosmopolitanism. Okay, I hope you're with me so far. I'm trying to lay out a historical genealogy, okay, bring us to the moment. It's an image of American society that has recently been put forward most cogently by the philosopher Anthony Appiah, who teaches at NYU and is known to all of you who read the New York Times. I bet you everybody in this group reads the New York Times, right? In the New York Times as the ethicist, okay? The ethicist who writes his Sunday column in the Times Magazine, right? By the way, in today's magazine, there is a charming, the first letter is absolutely charming. I sent it to my daughter. It's about a great-grandfather who wants to know the best way of instilling moral responsibility in his 8-year-old great-granddaughter. And I thought Anthony Appia, who is sort of cerebral, dealt with this with a great deal of sensitivity. It's absolutely lovely, and I agree with it, and I think it's worth looking at. Anyway, so everybody knows Anthony Appia from the ethics college. But so, question is, he's written a great deal about cosmopolitanism. This is his shtick at the moment, okay? So what is cosmopolitanism? Well, the word comes from the Greek, and it means literally citizen of the world. Now, at first glance, cosmopolitanism would seem to stand in direct opposition to the localism, provincialism, illiberal nationalism, and populism which has emerged in so many countries, including our own, in the past decade, and presents a threat to liberal democracy, which many of us would argue is the best form of government. It seems to put itself at one pole of our polarized society. Okay. In its assumed contempt for concrete local values and loyalties, cosmopolitanism has often gotten a bad rap, in that it seems to be identified with the very elitism, which is the object of so much disdain these days coming from the localist camps. More specifically, the cosmopolitan has been accused of being the type of person who loves humanity more than he or she loves real down-home human beings. The cosmopolitan sort of lives in abstractions. Moreover, the cosmopolitan, it is claimed, has more concern for the stranger on the other side of the world than to his neighbor next door, or perhaps is too preoccupied with others than even members of his own family who are closest to him. Or as Appia puts it, the cosmopolitan might be, quote, the frequent flyer who can scarcely glimpse his earthbound compatriots through the clouds. Okay, that's a type of description, end quote. In the Soviet Union in the Stalinist period, Jews were referred to as, quote, rootless cosmopolitans. It was an anti-Semitic slur implying that the Jew didn't really belong anywhere and therefore was unpatriotic. Okay. But in Appia's version of cosmopolitanism, these notions, these negative tropes, are mistaken. And I find his understanding of cosmopolitanism very attractive. In his view, the cosmopolitan outlook does not exist in opposition to local values and loyalties, and this is the important point. It more importantly incorporates them and extends them beyond to embrace much more. By his understanding, quote, the cosmopolitan task is to be able to focus on both far and near. Cosmopolitanism, he says, is an expansive act of the moral imagination. It sees human beings as shaping their lives within nesting memberships, a family, a neighborhood, a plurality of overlapping identity groups, spiraling out to all humanity. It asks us to be many things because we are many things, end quote. In other words, cosmopolitanism embraces and incorporates local allegiances, but also moves beyond them to embrace wider allegiances. It does two things at the same time. The implication of this is that when it comes to my own personal identity and my allegiances, it is not a question of either or, but of both and. I can and do have, speaking personally, multiple loyalties. So using myself as an example, I'm a resident of the city of Hackensack, a resident of New Jersey and of the United States, and I'm also a citizen of the world. If you asked me which I am most loyal to, the question really doesn't make all that much sense. When I vote in a local school referendum in Hackensack, as I did a few weeks ago, it matters most that I'm a Hackensackian. When I vote for a senator or representative, the city, state, and nation are all that matter to me. When I work for international human rights with Amnesty International, or on behalf of prisoners of conscience in foreign countries, or on behalf of political asylum seekers coming here, escaping persecution in faraway lands, I am very conscious of being an internationalist. I am all those things, like the little Matryoshka dolls, the Russian dolls. I mean, all those identities are embedded in me. None of these identities or loyalties contradict each other. All of them are parts of who I am. On the big issues, I can feel myself to be an American patriot. That doesn't ring so well with me, American patriot. Okay? When people ask you, are you a patriot? Yeah, I say there are two things I love, the Bill of Rights and the Rocky Mountains. I mean, that's about it. That's my American patriotism. I can feel myself to be an American patriot, but that is not necessarily a reason why I cannot commit myself to the fate of the earth and basically try to champion those things that will put an end or at least diminish global warming. Another very important point is that some cosmopolitans are seduced by the thinking that if everyone matters, then everyone must matter equally. And if this is true, then each of us has the same moral obligations to everyone. Very abstract. Therefore, being partial, favoring those who are connected by blood or culture or territory, can look arbitrary. In other words, if I am a citizen of the world, is it wrong to be partial to one's own place or to one's own people or one's own family for that matter? For those cosmopolitans who answer, quote, yes, it is that position which raises the contempt of those people I'm referring to as localists. It feels abstract, elitist, and simply too highbrow. But this impartiality is a fallacy. As Appia notes, quote, the fact of everyone mattering equally from the perspective of universal morality does not mean that each of us has the same obligations to everyone. He says, I have particular fondness for my nephews and nieces, one that does not extend to your nephews and nieces. Indeed, he says, it would be morally wrong not to favor my relatives when it comes to distributing my limited attention and treasure. Does it follow that I must hate your nephews and nieces or try to shape the world to their disadvantage? Surely not, he says. I can recognize the legitimate moral interests of your family while paying special attention to mine. It's not that my family matters more than yours, it's that it matters more to me, end quote. And according to Appia, there is no contradiction or anything wrong with that. You can have multiple allegiances. If you're a cosmopolitan, who loves everybody, it doesn't mean you have to basically not love your family, those closest to you, more. Okay, you can do both things at the same time, but you have to recognize the rights and interests and so on of those who are far away. This opens the door to another fundamental aspect of the cosmopolitan outlook, and that is that a cosmopolitan way of life needs to be accepting of the rights of others to be different from themselves. And in that acceptance, cosmopolitans need to extend the right, to be uncosmopolitan. Okay. Central to cosmopolitanism is that every human being matters, everyone counts, which lies at the heart of cosmopolitanism's universalism. And the reality of the human condition is that different people do have different values and may choose to live in community with people who share their language, customs, and values they think of as their own. And assuming some want to stay away from people unlike themselves, that too is their right. I think the stance of a genuine cosmopolitanism is not to want to impose one's own values on others who wish and choose to live by different and more parochial values. To think otherwise, I believe, is to be imperialistic. I think it's arrogant, and even to claim for oneself a certain infallibility. Speaking for myself as a humanist and as a primarily secular person, I have no interest, I should confess, I have no interest in turning everyone into a fact. The economy does shape values to a great extent, and I think we have to look at those issues. What is also needed to nurture a cosmopolitan society, and essential to it, is dialogue and the willingness to listen to views of those who are different, who are in a different camp. This is not to convert others to our view, but hopefully discover areas in which agreement is possible, things we hold in common despite the looming differences. On the other side, I think what is necessary to create a less acrimonious society is for each localist and tribal group to at least be girded with a zone of liberality. At a minimum, each group, whether Amish, Hasidic, or a community of gun rights advocates or pro-lifers, need to have, as I would think, their ambassadors, their emissaries who are willing to represent their communities and be devoted to engaging in dialogue with those cosmopolitans and liberals who hold opposing values and worldviews. How to achieve this more benevolent mosaic is a very difficult story, but I think it is necessary at a minimum. But when it comes down to the final reckoning, there may be no easy or harmonious resolution to the conflict between localists and cosmopolitans. There is a real struggle here, friends. It will need to embrace economics, political struggle, and ways to open dialogue between people who are now deaf to the positions and needs of others. Dialogue and listening to others who are different, as mentioned, is central to the cosmopolitan worldview as it is to reviving a viable democracy in this country. In the final analysis,
This contrast between those who I'm calling localists and the global view embraced by cosmopolitanism is not merely a question of personal preferences. It is not merely an aesthetic choice or choice of lifestyles. Those who have opted for localism at this moment, parochialism, tribalism in this country and elsewhere, in a sense, I think, have withdrawn from the world, where the greatest threats to the planet and human survival are to be found. Today, with carbon dioxide levels at their highest point in 800,000 years, with global warming threatening the fate of the planet, with 260 million international migrants, our problems are truly global and not local. In short, tribalism is a luxury that humanity can no longer afford. Therefore, we need each of us to develop an ethos that, while affirming our own sense of place and committing ourselves to our own values and those we love, also need to transcend our sense of place to embrace the world. I believe, friends, reality demands no less.